In the summer of 1959, London was heavy with the scent of roses and rain, and in a quiet room of a hospital, one of the brightest stars of post-war cinema slipped away. Kay Kendall, only 32 years of age, lay surrounded not by stage lights or applause, but by the hush of white sheets and the muted footsteps of nurses. A life that had burned so brilliantly, filled with laughter, wit, and glamour, came to an end so early that the world scarcely had time to grasp her brilliance. Dear listener, welcome. Before we begin our long journey through the life of this extraordinary woman, I invite you to pause for a moment. Let us form a circle across continents and oceans, a quiet network of memory where you may share in the comments when and where you are listening. Such shared recollections turn individual moments into collective remembrance. And if you would like to support this channel, to keep alive the gentle telling of these histories, I encourage you to press the subscribe button. Together, let us wander back through time, step by step, into the story of Kay Kendall. There is a place on the eastern coast of England where the winds from the North Sea sweep over flat marshes and the air carries a taste of salt and coal smoke. In this town of Witherspoon, on the 18th of May in the year 1927, Justine Kay Kendall McCarthy came into the world. The town was not a place of glamour, but rather a modest seaside resort, its pier jutting out into gray waters, its houses lined with soot-smudged bricks. For Kay, it would never truly be home, for her destiny lay elsewhere. Yet it was here that the earliest sounds she heard were the gulls circling overhead and the rustle of curtains in a rented room. Kay was born into a family already steeped in the traditions of performance. Her grandfather had been a music hall entertainer, and in his day the music hall was a place where ordinary folk could laugh, sing, and be transported for a brief hour away from toil. Her parents, too, carried the scent of the theater upon their clothing. Her father, Terence Kendall, was an actor of small reputation, and her mother, Margaret, moved within the same world of troupes and tours, shifting from one production to another like travelers moving across an endless map of provincial stages. From the very beginning, the world of Kay's childhood was one of constant motion. Theaters were not merely places of entertainment, but houses of living, breathing survival. Dressing rooms smelled of grease paint and dust, costumes hung on hooks beside mirrors dimmed by fingerprints, and on stage, wooden boards creaked beneath performers whose lives depended on applause. Such was the inheritance of Kay's earliest years, the rhythm of rehearsal, the uncertainty of travel, the whispered conversations about roles won and lost. Children in such families often carried both a gift and a burden. They absorbed without question the magic of performance, the way an actor's voice could ripple through a hall and make strangers lean forward in their seats. But they also absorbed the fragility of it all, how easily success could vanish, how often poverty waited behind the curtain. Kay would grow up knowing that life on the stage was not guaranteed, that fortune was fickle, and that behind the shimmer of illusion lay real hunger and disappointment. Yet to the little girl, all of this seemed a kind of wonder. Imagine her standing in the wings of a small theater, perhaps 5 or 6 years old, watching as the lights came up and her father strode forward into the glow. She might have pressed her small hand against the rough canvas backdrop, feeling the vibration of voices and the warm wave of laughter rolling from the unseen audience. In such moments, dreams were planted. She could not have known then that her own laughter, her own presence, would one day fill cinema screens across Britain and beyond. The town of Witherspoon, with its battered promenade and its sea winds, receded quickly into memory as the family moved on. There is little evidence that Kay formed lasting attachments there. Rather, her childhood was shaped by the constant travel of a theatrical clan. Hotels, boarding houses, and damp railway platforms were as familiar to her as the hearth of any permanent home might have been to others. Did she ever feel rootless, as so many children of the theater did? Or did the shifting scenery teach her to adapt, to slip with ease into whatever role the world presented? We can only wonder. By the time she reached school age, Kay's tall, slender frame and her wide eyes marked her out. She was not a conventional beauty in childhood, but there was already a liveliness to her, a spark that seemed to make her stand apart from other girls. Teachers sometimes recalled her quick wit, her occasional distraction, as though the classroom could never contain all of her restless energy. Books might hold her for a time, but it was mimicry, song, and gesture that most delighted her. She would imitate relatives, visitors, even the stern demeanor of instructors, sending others into stifled laughter. It is tempting to imagine that Kay's path was predestined, that a girl born into such a lineage and with such inclinations could hardly have chosen another life. But destiny is never so simple. There were choices, obstacles, perhaps even moments when the family might have wished her to pursue something steadier, something less uncertain. The stage and screen in Britain between the wars offered no easy path, especially for women who were often cast aside once their youth faded. Kay would one day challenge that by leaving her mark so vividly in so short a time. But in childhood, the risks must have seemed greater than the promises. Still, she grew among the smells of costume trunks and the chatter of itinerant actors, among the shifting fortunes of a family that knew both the sting of failure and the sweetness of applause. From such soil, her dreams took root. Perhaps it was inevitable that when she walked down the aisles of provincial theaters, small footsteps echoing against worn boards, she was already rehearsing for a life that would carry her far beyond those narrow stages. And yet, as the child pressed her hand against the armrest of an empty seat, the theater dark and silent around her, one wonders what she felt. Did she sense, even then, that her laughter would one day become a kind of echo across generations, her life both dazzling and brief? The empty theater held no answer, only the sound of distant waves rolling against the Yorkshire shore. The silence of that empty theater, where a child's small hand once pressed against the worn armrest of a seat, gave way in memory to the faint sound of strings being tuned in the dark. A violin, hesitant at first, testing its voice, then stretching into fuller notes. It was a sound familiar to Kay's family, for music and performance were the lifeblood that coursed through their lineage. To understand Kay's story, one must understand the family web that bound her to the stage long before she ever set foot upon it. Her grandfather, music hall artist Kay Kendall, had once been a figure of some small renown, a comedian and performer who traveled the halls of provincial England in the waning days of the Victorian tradition. The music hall was a world of bright lamps, raucous laughter, and crude jokes where ordinary people came to forget the weight of their lives. The applause of strangers was the coin that paid for survival, and to be a player upon such a stage required resilience as much as wit. Though time would dull the memory of his act, it remained in the family as a kind of myth. Kay grew up hearing fragments of it retold, the timing of a line, the way the crowd once roared in Sheffield or Manchester, the slow decline as audiences turned to newer amusements. The story of the grandfather who once commanded laughter was both a warning and an inheritance. Her father, Terence, carried that inheritance into a new age. He was not a star, but a working actor, appearing in touring companies, taking roles as they came, his life measured not by headlines, but by the steady rhythm of rehearsals and performances. To Kay, he was both an example and a shadow. She admired the craft, the discipline, but she also saw the precariousness of it. In her father's weary eyes after a performance, in the long silences when work was scarce, she learned that art did not always bring ease or recognition. Yet he carried himself with the pride of a man who belonged to that strange fraternity of the theater, men and women bound by their willingness to risk everything for the fleeting reward of applause. Her mother, Margaret, was equally part of this world. Though her name is less preserved in memory, she shared in the daily fabric of performance life, arranging costumes, supporting productions, managing the constant instability of a family without fixed roots. A mother's role in such a life was not simply domestic, it was logistical, emotional, and at times fiercely protective. Did she ever imagine her daughter would surpass them all? That the girl with the wide eyes would one day be remembered when their own names faded? Perhaps she did. Perhaps she did not. In families such as theirs, ambition often mingled with caution, for hope could be cruel when fortune was fickle. Kay's childhood, then, was steeped not only in the smell of grease paint and the sound of orchestras tuning, but in the stories of failure and perseverance that haunted every performer's life. It is said that she was christened Justine Kay Kendall McCarthy, though from the beginning the name Kay Kendall seemed to shimmer above her like a destiny, a stage name that was also a true name, easy to remember, easy to love. The rhythm of it, like a bell tolling twice, would later sparkle on cinema posters across the land. But in those early years, she was still only a tall, lively girl with a laugh that carried down hallways and a presence that seemed larger than her frame. Her sister, Kim, shared in these years too, and together they formed the companionship that sisters often do in a world of constant travel. They learned to rely on one another when towns were unfamiliar, when lodgings were cold, when the uncertainty of their parents' profession weighed upon the household. In Kim, Kay found a mirror and a confidant, though even then it was clear that Kay's energy would not easily be contained. The family's world was not one of wealth. To travel as actors meant modest incomes, uncertain lodgings, and the constant hustle for the next engagement. Yet poverty in such families was often masked by the shimmer of performance itself. A gown might be patched and re-sewn until it looked new beneath the lights. A hotel room might feel like a palace when laughter from a performance still echoed in the mind. For a child, this alternation between scarcity and splendor was bewildering. And perhaps it planted in Kay the later hunger for glamour, for champagne, for jewels that sparkled not with necessity but with delight. When Kay was old enough to ask about her grandfather's career, she would have heard not only of applause, but of the decline of the music hall itself, overtaken by cinema and new forms of entertainment. She may have sensed, even then, that she belonged to a family straddling two eras, the fading Edwardian tradition of variety and the new age of the silver screen. It was as if she were born at the hinge of time, her destiny to bridge the world of her forebears and the modern world that awaited her. What does it mean to inherit such a legacy? For some, it is a burden, a weight of expectation pressing down. For others, it is a torch, a spark to be carried further. For Kay, it seemed to be both. The stories of the Kendall name in music halls and provincial theaters might have been a reminder of how easily fame slipped away, but they were also a whisper that such brilliance was possible. She grew tall, graceful, and increasingly aware that she was not like other girls in her classrooms or streets. She belonged to a different world, one of lights and mirrors, where applause was the measure of worth. Sometimes, when the family gathered in quiet evenings, her father might recall a line or a song from his own performances. He might hum a tune, his voice trailing into laughter. In such moments, Kay saw not just the hardships, but the joy of belonging to this fragile, flickering profession. And in those half-lit rooms, the sound of a violin tuning in the dark might well have echoed in her mind, a reminder of where she came from and where she might go. The legacy of the Kendalls was never one of riches, but it was one of spirit, of resilience, of daring to stand before strangers and risk rejection in pursuit of wonder. It shaped her childhood like an unseen hand, and though she was not yet aware of the path it set for her, she carried it within her like a seed waiting to bloom. The violin's note lingered, stretched into silence, and in that silence the air grew heavy with another sound, low and distant, the wail of a siren cutting across a darkened sky, the world shifting as war crept into her adolescence. The wail of the siren tore through the silence, a sound that no child of her generation would ever forget. It rose and fell, stretching across the rooftops of Britain, a cry that carried both warning and weariness, summoning families to cellars, to shelters, to whispered prayers in the dark. For Kay, who was still a girl when the war deepened, this was the sound of adolescence, an accompaniment to the fragile dreams of youth. It was the music of danger and endurance, of a world where futures seemed perpetually uncertain. The theater, so central to her family's life, was transformed by war. Performances continued, for even in the darkest hours people sought laughter and diversion. But the glamour was threadbare. Costumes were mended again and again, scripts were cut to fit curfews, audiences huddled together in half-filled halls, while outside the world threatened to crumble. Kay, tall and restless, was now old enough to sense that she was living through something immense, something that pressed upon her generation with a weight that could not be ignored. Her laughter, so often described as infectious in later years, was in those times a rebellion against fear, a way of insisting that joy might still exist even when the night skies blazed with searchlights. School was interrupted, routines broken, classrooms grew cold when coal was scarce, lessons were scattered by evacuations, and friendships were often torn apart by sudden relocations. For a girl whose family was already itinerant, the war only deepened the feeling that permanence was a luxury. She was learning to live in fragments of towns, fragments of education, fragments of safety. Did she ever sit awake in the night, listening to the dull thud of bombs in the distance, wondering if her future would ever truly begin? Perhaps she did, for even the most resilient children could not escape such thoughts. And yet, war also sharpened her awareness of life's brevity. Many who knew Kay later remarked on her zest, her refusal to be dull, her delight in the absurdities of life. One wonders if this was not rooted in those years when every day carried the possibility of sudden loss. If the world could end in a moment, then every moment had to be seized, savored, and made to sparkle. In such an atmosphere, wit became a weapon, laughter became defiance, and glamour became not indulgence, but survival. The young girl, so long immersed in the drifting world of her family's theater, now watched as soldiers in uniforms filled the streets, as ration lines grew longer, as newspapers carried lists of the fallen. She may have attended dances, as so many young women did, seeking lightness amid the shadows. Music floated through halls where blackout curtains were drawn tight, and couples swayed as though tomorrow were assured, even when it was not. Did Kay dance then? Her tall frame awkward and yet graceful, her laughter lifting her partners above the heaviness of their own fears? It seems likely, for she would always be known for her presence, her ability to draw attention without effort. The war years also altered the world of cinema. The British film industry, though constrained, still produced comedies and dramas to raise morale. Stars of that era became icons, their images pinned on walls and carried in pockets by soldiers far from home. To a girl like Kay, who dreamed of performance, these stars were not distant gods, but models to be studied, emulated, perhaps even surpassed. The dream of film flickered even as the sirens wailed, a light beyond the darkness. Yet, her own path was not yet clear. She was tall, willowy, with features that some found striking, but not conventionally beautiful. In those years, she may have wondered whether she had the face for the screen, whether her wit and liveliness could ever be captured by a camera. Doubt must have shadowed her, as it shadows all who stand on the threshold of art. And yet, even in doubt, there was determination. The war may have scattered her education, but it also gave her resilience, a kind of steel beneath the charm that would later carry her through disappointments and betrayals. As the war dragged on, adolescence turned to young adulthood. Kay grew into her height, into her presence. She could no longer be mistaken for a child, and the world began to notice her in ways both subtle and overt. Her family's theatrical connections gave her entry into circles where performance was discussed not as fantasy, but as livelihood. She began to imagine her own place in that world more vividly, no longer merely the daughter of actors, but a potential actress herself. Perhaps she practiced lines before a mirror. Perhaps she mimicked voices she had heard on stage. These small rehearsals, unnoticed by most, were the beginnings of a craft that would one day win her acclaim. The end of the war did not bring immediate clarity. Britain emerged scarred, its cities shattered, its economy weakened. But there was also a hunger for renewal, for laughter, for beauty. Kay was now a young woman poised to step into this world, her formative years shaped by the resilience of a nation that had endured 6 years of uncertainty. She carried in her the memory of sirens and ration queues, but also the memory of laughter breaking through the dark. These would become part of her identity, woven into the wit and brightness she brought to every role. Sometimes, those who shine most brightly are those who have lived in shadow. Kay's adolescence, marked by war, was such a shadowed time. It taught her impermanence, but also the preciousness of joy. When later she would walk into a room and command it with a quip, when she would dazzle audiences with her timing, it was not merely talent at play. It was survival transformed into art. And so the wail of the siren receded into memory, replaced now by the low hum of post-war Britain rebuilding itself. Streets were cleared of rubble, cinemas reopened their doors, and the promise of new beginnings hung in the air. For Kay, this promise meant the chance to take her first steps not only onto stages, but into the world of film, where the applause of a theater could be multiplied 1,000-fold on screens across the nation. Yet before she reached that point, there would be long rehearsals, minor roles, moments of disappointment. For every star who seemed to ascend effortlessly, there were countless, unseen struggles. Kay's journey would be no exception. The war had ended, but the struggle for recognition was just beginning. And so, from the echo of sirens, another sound began to emerge. The hesitant but thrilling applause of an audience, scattered at first, uncertain, but growing louder as a young actress stepped forward to meet her destiny. The scattered applause at first was hesitant, like raindrops falling on a roof before the storm gathers. Yet for a young woman stepping forward from the shadows of rehearsal halls into the glow of the stage, that faint sound was enough to quicken the heart. Kay stood there, tall and willowy, the boards of the theater trembling beneath her shoes, the air heavy with the smell of old wood and dust, mingled with the faint trace of powder from the orchestra pit. She had come at last to the moment that every child of the theater both dreams of and dreads, the moment when fantasy dissolves into reality and one discovers whether the world will welcome you or let you fall. Her earliest stage roles were modest, often little more than decorative appearances in provincial productions. The parts demanded more presence than depth, more beauty than craft. Yet for Kay, these were not dismissals, but initiations. Every line she uttered, every gesture she attempted, was a lesson. She studied the timing of older actors, the way they carried silence as though it were another line of dialogue, the way they bent laughter toward themselves without appearing to grasp for it. In such company, she learned humility, for the stage is a merciless teacher. When the line fell flat, the silence was unbearable. When it succeeded, the reward was instantaneous. The theater of post-war Britain was a curious place. The grand days of Edwardian spectacle had passed, yet austerity had left audiences hungry for distraction. People crowded into playhouses that smelled of damp coats and cigarettes, seeking escape from ration books and rebuilding. In these spaces, Kay honed her presence, though she was still far from the polished figure who would one day command the screen. Her voice was still raw, her posture sometimes awkward, her confidence flickering like a candle in the drafts of those cold auditoriums. But beneath the surface, Something undeniable was forming, a quickness, a lightness, a capacity to fill silence with charm. Often she lingered after performances, wandering through the rows of empty seats when the audience had gone. The echo of applause clung faintly to the walls as though the theater itself breathed with memory. She would stand before a mirror in a backstage corridor, her makeup half smudged, her costume no longer shimmering beneath the lights, and she would search her own reflection. Who was she becoming? Was she still the restless child of traveling players, or had she begun to claim her own identity upon the stage? The mirror, as always, gave no answer. Only the faint crackle of a fading light bulb reminded her that the world outside still waited. There were failures, too. Auditions that went nowhere, roles promised and then withdrawn, critics who overlooked her entirely. For every small success, there were days when the struggle seemed endless, when she wondered if she would ever rise beyond the minor parts allotted to her. Yet the memory of wartime, of sirens and uncertainty, had given her a kind of steel. She knew already that life was precarious, that security was an illusion. Better to risk disappointment in pursuit of joy than to live safely in shadows. Her family, though not wealthy, supported her ambitions with what encouragement they could offer. Her father's pride was quiet but real. He understood, more than most, the hazards of the path she had chosen. Her mother, too, offered steady affection, though she may have wished for her daughter a more stable life. But there was little chance of that. Kay's temperament was already too lively, her imagination too restless to be contained within the ordinary. As she moved from one small production to another, she began to feel the allure of cinema calling. The stage, for all its immediacy, was confined to the here and now. A performance ended when the curtain fell, but the silver screen could preserve a gesture, a smile, a line forever. Films reached audiences beyond the dusty halls of provincial theaters. They traveled to towns she had never seen, across oceans she might never cross. To step into that world was to step into a kind of immortality. Yet before that leap, she still had much to learn in the theater. Timing, presence, vulnerability. These were not gifts, but skills shaped by repetition. She failed often, but each failure carved away uncertainty, leaving her sharper, surer, more aware of how to use her tall frame and expressive face. Laughter became her ally. She discovered that her wit, spontaneous and quick, could win over both audiences and colleagues. What had once been an unruly energy in schoolrooms was now a tool, refined and deliberate. There is something haunting about those early years on stage, when promise exists but fame is still a distant dream. The photographs from that time show a young woman not yet radiant, not yet secure, but already marked by that spark which would soon astonish critics. In her gaze there is both determination and uncertainty, a mixture that gives her a strangely human appeal. We know now that her time would be short, but she could not know it then. She moved forward as though the future were infinite. Theaters with their echoes of laughter and silence shaped her during those years. They gave her not only a place to practice, but also a sense of belonging. For all their hardships, actors form a family of sorts, bound together by the rituals of rehearsal, the intimacy of shared failures, the fragile joy of shared success. Kay became part of that fraternity, a young woman growing into her craft among men and women who knew the costs of a life devoted to performance. And when at last the curtain fell on one of those early performances, the applause was stronger than before, no longer hesitant but warm, a sound that filled the small theater like the tide filling a bay. Kay stood there, bowing slightly, her eyes glimmering beneath the lights, and in that moment she must have felt the first real taste of what was to come. The mirror awaited her backstage, reflecting her flushed face, her smudged makeup, the sweat at her temples. She looked at herself differently that night, no longer as the child of traveling players, but as someone who had begun to earn her own applause. The reflection was still uncertain, still half in shadow, but it carried a promise. And in that reflection, half in shadow, half in light, she began to imagine a wider world, beyond the small theaters, beyond the narrow corridors of provincial acclaim. The mirror offered no map, but in its glass shimmered a possibility, a director somewhere, pausing over her name, wondering if she might be the one to fill a role not yet cast. The mirror that reflected her face, half in shadow, half in light, seemed to dissolve into another image, a sheet of paper upon a director's desk, a cast list scrawled in ink. Fingers hovered over the names, pausing upon hers as though uncertain whether to pass over it or to give it breath. For every actor, such a moment holds the weight of destiny, whether a name becomes embodied on the screen or remains buried among the forgotten. Kay's name, still unfamiliar, carried the cadence of possibility. And so it was that the world of cinema first opened its doors to her, not with a triumphant entrance, but with the quiet chance of minor roles. The British film industry of the late 1940s and early 1950s was in flux, striving to rebuild itself in a nation still scarred by war. Studios, often modest compared to the grandeur of Hollywood, nevertheless produced comedies, thrillers, and romances that gave audiences both comfort and escape. For a young actress like Kay, these studios were labyrinths of opportunity and frustration. She entered them first not as a star, but as a face in the crowd, a name at the bottom of the bill. Her earliest appearances were brief, sometimes little more than a glance or a gesture caught by the camera before it moved on. These moments seldom registered with critics or audiences. Yet for Kay, they were lessons as vital as any she had learned on the stage. Film demanded something different from theater. The stage required projection, exaggeration, gestures large enough to reach the back of the hall. The camera, by contrast, punished excess and rewarded stillness. Every flicker of an eyelash, every pause in a sentence could carry meaning. Kay began to study this new medium with the same restless energy that had once driven her to mimic teachers and relatives. She was learning to let the camera come to her, to trust that her vitality would find its way through the lens without strain. In films such as London Town, 1946, and other forgotten titles of the era, she was present but almost invisible, a figure passing through frames already crowded with other ambitions. To many, these roles would have seemed disappointing. To Kay, they were stepping stones, small footholds on a wall that seemed impossibly high. She carried herself with a mixture of humility and determination, aware that the world was full of hopeful young women vying for the same slivers of attention. Yet there was something about her, an effervescence, a quickness, that made her difficult to dismiss entirely. It is easy, looking back now, to imagine her rise as inevitable. But in those years, there was no certainty. Many of her contemporaries began with equal promise and vanished without trace. Kay herself might have faded into obscurity, remembered only as the tall, striking girl who appeared for a moment on screen before life carried her elsewhere. But she was not easily erased. Casting directors noticed her height, her unconventional beauty, her air of sophistication that belied her years. Even when the role was small, she drew the eye. Yet recognition was slow. There were days when she must have felt trapped between worlds, not unknown, yet not celebrated, not amateur, yet not secure. The life of an actor in such a position is full of uncertainty. Letters arrive with offers that vanish overnight. Auditions promise much and deliver little. Hope flares, then fades. Through it all, she carried the memory of applause, the echo of laughter, the sense that she belonged to performance as surely as a bird belongs to the air. Sometimes she would wander the sets when shooting paused, walking past cameras and cables, listening to the murmur of crews. The smell of warm lights and fresh paint on hastily built scenery filled her senses. She knew that these constructions were fragile, destined to be dismantled, yet while they stood, they felt like real worlds. Perhaps she touched a prop, a painted wall, imagining herself not as a visitor, but as a rightful inhabitant of such places. To claim that space fully was her quiet ambition. There is a poignancy in these years, for they reveal the patience and endurance behind the glamour that audiences later assumed had always been hers. Before the champagne parties, before the witty quips quoted in newspapers, there was a young woman standing for hours on cold sets, waiting for her moment, adjusting her costume, listening to instructions. There was doubt, too. Did she ever return home after long days, her spirit sinking as she looked in the mirror and wondered if the camera would ever truly love her? Such moments are lost to history, yet they must have existed, for no actor ascends without them. Her family, still tethered to the world of stage performance, must have watched with mixed emotions. Pride, certainly, that she was stepping into a medium grander than anything they had known, but perhaps also apprehension. Cinema was ruthless. Unlike the theater, where reputations might endure in small circles, film exposed every flaw to the unblinking gaze of the camera and the equally unforgiving judgment of critics. Yet Kay moved forward undeterred. She was not one to be frightened by risk. As the 1950s dawned, her appearances remained modest, but there were glimmers of something more. Producers began to notice her timing, her natural ability to make a scene lighter simply by entering it. She was no tragic heroine in those early years, no grand diva. Rather, she was often placed in roles requiring wit, sparkle, a kind of effortless brightness. If the films themselves were sometimes forgettable, her presence was not. The director's hand that had once hesitated over her name began to pause more often, less uncertainly. She was becoming a familiar figure in studios, known if not yet celebrated, appreciated if not yet adored. The path remained steep, but she was climbing. And yet, through all of it, she still felt the ache of being overlooked. She longed for a role that would not simply use her as decoration or background, but would allow her to inhabit a character fully, to reveal the depth beneath the sparkle. This longing grew stronger with each film, with each polite review that mentioned her in passing. The applause she dreamed of was not scattered or hesitant, but full and unmistakable, the kind that affirmed her place beyond doubt. At the end of one such day on set, after hours of waiting for her brief scene, she might have walked out into the London night, the lamps casting long shadows on the wet pavement. The city was still rebuilding, its scars visible in broken walls and empty lots, but life thrummed in it again. She walked with her coat pulled tight, her thoughts filled with dreams of what might yet come. The applause of the theater was behind her, the promise of cinema still lay ahead. And so, somewhere in the dim corridors of a studio, reels of film turned quietly, preserving her presence, however small, upon the screen. The clicking of those reels filled the air, mechanical and steady, a rhythm that seemed to whisper of a future not yet written. The reels clicked on, turning with mechanical steadiness in the half-lit rooms of the studio, preserving frames that might have seemed inconsequential to most, but carried for her the promise of permanence. That sound, so ordinary to the technicians who threaded and rewound film each day, became in its rhythm a quiet prophecy, as though it were whispering that the day would come when her image would no longer pass unnoticed, when her laughter and her timing would be the very heart of the story. And in time, that prophecy revealed itself in a film about cars and competition, about light-hearted rivalry and the absurdities of human pride. Its title was simple, Genevieve, yet for Kay Kendall it was nothing less than a door opening onto the world. The film, released in 1953, was a comedy about two couples and a vintage car rally. On the surface, it was a light and almost whimsical tale, far from the grand dramas of the age. Yet it captured something in the post-war mood of Britain, a hunger for laughter, a delight in eccentricity, a reminder that joy could be found in simple contests and absurd mishaps. For Kay Cast as Rosalind Peters, it was the role that transformed her from a supporting figure into a star. Rosalind was not a grand heroine, but a lively, witty, slightly unpredictable woman whose presence carried every scene she entered. Kay played her with an effervescence that seemed utterly natural, as though she were not acting at all but merely allowing her own vitality to flow through the character. She was tall, elegant, and yet never stiff. Her voice carried a playful irony that made even the smallest line sparkle. Audiences who had scarcely noticed her before now found themselves enchanted. Critics, too, wrote of her with delight, praising her comic timing, her freshness, her ability to command attention without effort. It is said that one performance can alter the course of a life, and for Kay, Genevieve was precisely that. After years of minor parts and uncertain recognition, she was suddenly at the center of attention. Her name appeared prominently in newspapers, her photographs in magazines, her laughter echoing from cinema screens across the country. The applause she had once heard in small theaters now multiplied into something far greater, the applause of a nation. But fame, though sweet, was never without complexity. With recognition came scrutiny, and with opportunity came expectation. Those who had overlooked her now sought her out, eager to capture the same magic in new films. Producers imagined her in comedies, in romances, in roles that would showcase her wit and her beauty. She was celebrated for her glamour, for her elegance, for the way she seemed to embody a new ideal of British femininity. Sophisticated, witty, self-possessed. Yet beneath the surface of such praise, there was always the risk of confinement. To be celebrated for one quality is also to be trapped by it. Kay knew already that she was more than a charming figure in a frothy comedy. She longed to explore deeper roles, to prove her craft could stretch beyond laughter. Still, in those first bright days after Genevieve, the exhilaration must have been overwhelming. Imagine her walking into a theater for the film's premiere, the audience buzzing with anticipation, the smell of fresh paint and velvet mingling with perfume and cigarette smoke. She sat among them, waiting, and then there she was, her own face, larger than life, filling the screen. The laughter that followed, the delight that spread through the hall, must have been unlike anything she had ever known. For once, the applause at the end was not hesitant, not polite, but thunderous. She had arrived. Yet fame is never a single moment. It is a tide that carries one forward whether prepared or not. In the wake of Genevieve, Kay's life quickened. Invitations arrived. Parties were held. Her name was spoken in circles of society she had once only glimpsed from afar. She was witty and sharp, able to hold her own among writers, actors, aristocrats. Tall and striking, she cut a figure that was both admired and envied. Women sought to imitate her style. Men were drawn to her presence. She belonged, at last, to the glittering world she had so long dreamed of. But if the world saw only glamour, it did not see the doubts that lingered. Success, once achieved, must be defended, and Kay knew that audiences could be fickle. Was she merely lucky with one role, or would she prove herself again and again? The question haunted her even as champagne glasses clinked and photographers' bulbs flashed. For every dazzling night of praise, there was a morning when she looked into the mirror and wondered how long the brightness could last. There was something poignant in her triumph in Genevieve, for it was both a beginning and a warning. It revealed her brilliance but also risked defining her too narrowly. The industry, eager to capitalize, would cast her in roles that echoed Rosalind's charm, seeking to repeat the success rather than to expand it. And while she brought lightness and wit to each, she longed to show more. Her artistry, still deepening, demanded new challenges. Yet in the early years of fame, such challenges were slow to come. Still, she sparkled. In interviews, she offered quips that made journalists laugh. In society gatherings, she seemed to float, tall and radiant, her laughter carrying across rooms filled with smoke and chatter. She was becoming a symbol of a new post-war elegance, a Britain that could once again celebrate beauty and wit after years of austerity. She seemed to embody hope as much as entertainment, and audiences loved her for it. In the quiet moments, though, away from the crowds and cameras, she may have recalled the hesitant applause of her earliest stage roles, the uncertain reflections in backstage mirrors, the long hours of waiting on film sets. Perhaps she felt gratitude that those days had prepared her, had given her the resilience to withstand the pressures of fame. Or perhaps she felt a shadow of fear that fortune, so long withheld, might once again slip away. As the success of Genevieve echoed across Britain, Kay's future seemed assured. Offers multiplied, her schedule filled, and her name became one that people knew, one that critics debated, one that audiences cheered. She had entered the light fully, leaving behind the shadows of anonymity. And yet, even amid such brightness, there lingered a faint sound, a cough muffled beneath the music of laughter, a reminder that even the brightest stars carry within them shadows not yet revealed. The cough was quiet, tucked beneath the rush of laughter and music, scarcely noticed in the glittering rooms where champagne glasses clinked and cigarette smoke curled into chandeliers. It was the sound of something hidden, something yet unnamed, but for the time being, it dissolved into the gaiety around her. London in the early 1950s was a city eager to forget hardship, eager to dress itself once more in elegance, and Kay Kendall was one of its brightest ornaments. She moved through soirees and supper clubs like a flame flickering at the center of a gathering, tall and radiant, her voice carrying wit that made strangers lean closer. She was not only admired for her beauty, though that was often mentioned, but for her brilliance of manner. She had a gift for speaking lightly of serious things, for turning an awkward silence into shared laughter, for deflecting flattery with a jest so quick that even those bested by her wit found themselves charmed. In a society still recovering from the austerity of war, she embodied a new spirit, glamorous yet approachable, elegant yet mischievous. Newspapers wrote of her with delight, photographers sought her image, and party hosts were proud to have her name upon their guest lists. The London of that time was not merely a city but a stage. Its restaurants, clubs, and drawing rooms formed a network where reputations were built as much on presence as on achievement. To walk into those rooms required confidence, and Kay carried herself with a mixture of grace and irreverence that made her unforgettable. Her height alone drew attention, but it was her quicksilver mind that held it. Men admired her, women imitated her, and society embraced her as though she were the embodiment of a new golden age. Yet there was always the paradox of fame. The more the world adored her, the more it demanded from her. She had to sparkle even when weary, to laugh even when silent moods pressed upon her. There was little room for stillness, for the private self. Perhaps she did not always mind, for performance was as natural to her as breath. But in the small hours after the music had faded and the last guests had departed, she must have known the cost of always being radiant. The cough in her throat, the fatigue that lingered in her limbs, hinted at shadows that society's lights could not dispel. In those years, she adorned films as well as drawing rooms. Producers placed her in comedies that showcased her vivacity, in romances where her elegance carried the screen. Audiences delighted in seeing on film what they had read in the papers: the wit, the glamour, the effortless grace. Yet critics sometimes questioned whether she would be confined to one type, whether her gifts would ever be allowed to stretch into more serious roles. Kay herself must have felt the same question stirring within. For though she was grateful for the admiration, she hungered for the chance to show that beneath the sparkle lay a depth not yet revealed. And still, she lived fully in those moments. Imagine her at a party in Mayfair, the room shimmering with silk dresses and polished shoes, the air thick with smoke and perfume. Someone tells a story and she interrupts with a line so perfectly timed that the entire room erupts in laughter. Glasses are raised to her, and she smiles, tall among them, her presence unmistakable. In that instant, she is the queen of the gathering, and the memory of her fills the minds of those who leave long after the music fades. But what is it to be the center of a world built upon appearances? The question lingers, for even as she delighted in company, she sometimes felt the solitude of being always observed. The charm that won her admiration could also keep others at a distance, turning her into an image rather than a confidant. Did she ever long, in those nights of endless laughter, for someone to see beyond the wit, beyond the glamour, into the private girl who once stood in empty theaters dreaming of applause? London embraced her, yet it also consumed her. Each season demanded new gowns, new quips, new appearances. Her name was linked in gossip columns to suitors and admirers, some real, some invented. She played the role society had written for her, but she did so with such brilliance that even those who saw the performance mistook it for truth. Beneath the glitter, the cough remained, a faint rhythm reminding her that the body does not always bow to the demands of fame. There were nights when the music grew too loud, when the champagne dulled rather than brightened her senses, when laughter felt like a mask. She would return home, remove her gown, wash away the powder from her face, and look into the mirror. The woman staring back was both the celebrated Kay Kendall and the quiet Justine McCarthy, daughter of traveling actors, still searching for permanence. Between those two selves there was tension, a gap that no party could fully bridge. And yet she pressed forward, for to retreat was unthinkable. The world adored her, and she could not disappoint it. Her laughter became a shield, her glamour a kind of armor. If others sensed the effort behind it, they seldom said so. To them, she was simply dazzling. To her, she was both dazzling and weary. London society, hungry for symbols of renewal, had made her its muse. But society, like audiences in theaters, is fickle. Applause can fade as quickly as it rises. Kay, with her intelligence and her awareness of impermanence, must have known this. Perhaps that is why she laughed so loudly, why she lived so brightly, because she understood that nothing in her world could last forever. And in the corner of one such gathering, amid the glow of chandeliers and the clatter of glasses, she muffled another cough, unnoticed by most. It was small, almost delicate, but it lingered in her chest longer than it should have. Beyond the laughter and the glamour, the body was whispering of struggles yet to come. The music played on, violin sweeping through a waltz. Guests twirled across polished floors, their shoes tapping lightly, and over it all the sound of a reel of film spinning in a projection room somewhere in the city, clicking steadily, carrying her image into the darkness where audiences waited. That clicking would continue, night after night, even as the cough grew more insistent, weaving shadows into her golden days. The reel clicked on in the darkened projection room, its steady rhythm filling the silence between bursts of laughter from the audience beyond the door. Each turn of celluloid carried her image further into the world, not merely as a pretty face or a fashionable figure, but as a presence whose timing, wit, and brightness made scenes come alive. It was in these moments, as audiences leaned forward, that her artistry deepened. For Kay Kendall was not content to be simply admired. She longed to master the delicate craft of making people laugh, of holding them in that suspended space between amusement and affection. Comedy, though it often appears effortless, is among the hardest of arts. To make strangers laugh requires more than charm. It requires timing as precise as a heartbeat, the courage to risk silence, the grace to turn error into delight. Kay discovered that her height, which might have been a disadvantage to others, became for her a tool. She used it to stride across scenes with boldness, to exaggerate gestures in ways that drew the eye, to loom just enough over her partners so that the smallest tilt of her head became comical. Her body, once awkward in schoolrooms, now became an instrument finely tuned for humor. But humor alone was not enough. Beneath the sparkle of her performances, she sought a deeper truth. She understood that comedy could be more than frivolity. It could be a lens through which to glimpse human folly and tenderness. In each role, she tried to give more than a surface laugh, to suggest the longing or insecurity hidden beneath. This layering gave her performances a warmth that audiences instinctively felt, even if critics could not always name it. She was not mocking life, but embracing it, laughing with rather than at. In films such as Doctor in the House, 1954, and later The Reluctant Debutante, 1958, she honed this gift, creating characters who were at once glamorous and human, witty yet vulnerable. She played women who could dazzle a room but also trip on a hem, who could outwit a suitor but blush in the next breath. The combination made her irresistible. She had become not merely an actress but a kind of companion to audiences, someone whose laughter seemed to invite theirs, whose flaws made her beauty approachable. Colleagues often spoke of her quickness on set, a line delivered with unexpected inflection, a pause stretched just enough to make the crew stifle laughter, a sudden glance that turned an ordinary scene into something memorable. Directors learned to trust her instincts, for she brought vitality to scripts that might otherwise have fallen flat. She was no longer the hesitant figure from early forgotten films, waiting for approval. She had found her rhythm, her confidence, her ability to bend the mechanics of comedy to her will. Off-screen, this artistry seeped into her manner. Conversations became performances of their own, filled with witty rejoinders, sudden impressions, unexpected turns of phrase. She had become a kind of enchantress of language, able to lift the mood of any gathering with her verbal dexterity. Yet those who listened closely sometimes caught a shadow behind the sparkle, a quick change of subject, a deflection of questions that grew too personal. For comedy, while it reveals, also conceals. The applause grew louder in these years. Critics wrote of her with greater seriousness, acknowledging that beneath the glamour lay a true craftswoman. She was compared with American comedians whose brilliance defined an era, yet Kay remained distinctly British in her sensibility. Her humor carried a certain dryness, an elegance threaded with irony, a refusal to overplay. In this, she embodied the spirit of her nation at the time, witty yet reserved, playful yet dignified. Still, she wrestled with limitations. The industry, eager to capitalize on her comic brilliance, often hesitated to cast her in dramatic roles. She longed to explore deeper emotions, to prove that her artistry was not confined to laughter. Yet opportunities remained scarce. Did she lie awake at night, imagining herself in tragedies, in complex dramas, roles that would demand her full emotional range? Perhaps she did, for no artist is ever satisfied with a single note, however beautifully struck. The cough that lingered in her chest sometimes interrupted this pursuit. On set, she masked it with laughter. In society, she excused it lightly. Few around her suspected its significance, for she seemed too alive, too radiant to be unwell. And so the applause drowned it out, as if laughter could silence shadows. But in private moments when fatigue settled heavily, she must have felt the body's quiet warning. Even so, she pressed forward, pouring herself into each performance. She was aware of time, perhaps not in the prophetic sense, but in the urgency that war had already instilled in her generation. Life was fragile, fleeting, uncertain. Why not seize every opportunity, live every moment brightly, laugh as loudly as possible? Her artistry was not merely a profession, but a philosophy, a way of resisting the brevity she sensed in existence itself. The projection reels continued to click in theaters across Britain, across Europe, even across the Atlantic. Audiences who had never heard her name a few years before now spoke it with affection, recalling lines, gestures, the way her laugh seemed to spill from the screen into their own lives. Her presence had become part of their memories, woven into the fabric of post-war cinema. And yet, amid the applause, the laughter, the sparkling wit, One question remained unanswered. Could she find, beyond the delight of comedy, a role or a love that would see her not as an image, not as a performer, but as the woman herself? The question lingered, unspoken, as the film reels spun to their end, the clicking slowing, then stopping, leaving only silence. From that silence, another sound began. A spoon stirring against a china cup at an empty breakfast table, the faint clatter echoing in the absence of company. It was the sound of solitude, of longing, of the spaces between laughter. The spoon stirred softly against the porcelain, a small circle traced again and again in the silence of an empty breakfast table. The sound was delicate, almost fragile, and yet it echoed louder than the applause of theaters or the laughter of soirees. For in such quiet moments, Kay Kendall felt the solitude that glamour could not dispel. She was adored by audiences, admired by society, sought after at parties. Yet when the morning sun filtered through curtains and no companion sat across from her, she knew the loneliness that often hides behind fame. Her romances in those years were many, though few lasted. She was admired, of course. Tall, striking, quick-witted, she attracted men with ease. But attraction is not the same as understanding. Many were drawn to the image of her, to the dazzling actress who could make a room glitter with laughter, but fewer cared to see the quieter self beneath the sparkle. In such liaisons, she often played the same role society had written for her, witty, charming, a companion who lifted spirits. Yet when the music ended, she remained unfulfilled. There were suitors whose names flickered briefly in gossip columns, admirers who courted her with flowers and dinners. Some were fellow actors, drawn to her presence on set. Others were men of means who saw in her beauty and celebrity a prize to be won. She entertained them, enjoyed their company for a time, but rarely did they reach her heart. For Kay was not easily deceived. She could sense when affection was for her fame rather than for herself, when love was offered as performance rather than truth. And so, breakfasts were often solitary, the spoon circling the cup while the newspapers spoke of her in terms of glamour and gaiety. Did she ever wonder then if true companionship would elude her? Did she fear that the wit which delighted so many might also shield her too well, leaving her hidden behind her own sparkle? These are questions history cannot answer, but in the quietness of those mornings, they may have pressed upon her. She was known to her friends as a woman of immense warmth, but also of restlessness. She loved company, yet she could be impatient with pretense. If a suitor bored her, she would not linger politely, but cut the evening short with a quip that left him laughing even as she walked away. Her independence was striking in a time when women in her position were often expected to bend more readily to admiration. She was willing to be alone rather than be diminished. But loneliness is not easily dismissed. There were nights when the city sparkled around her, and yet she returned to her rooms with a hollow sense that the laughter had been borrowed, not shared. For though she could fill an evening with brightness, she longed for the intimacy of being known, truly known, beyond the mask of glamour. That intimacy eluded her in these years. Her family, though proud of her fame, could not always bridge the distance of her new world. They remained connected to the stage, to the life of small productions and provincial circuits, while she now moved in circles of film and society. The conversations they shared were affectionate, but carried the undercurrent of two worlds diverging. She must have felt the ache of separation, the sense that her ascent into celebrity came at the cost of certain bonds. Romances flickered in and out, some sincere, others fleeting. Friends later recalled that she never seemed to be in want of admirers, and yet she rarely gave herself fully. Perhaps she feared disappointment, or perhaps she sensed that her path was leading elsewhere, toward a love that would be unlike the rest, fiery, scandalous, all-consuming. But that was still in the future. For now, she lingered in the in-between, filling her life with laughter and company, yet carrying in her heart a quiet solitude. On set, she sometimes joked about her lack of a settled romance, deflecting curiosity with humor. "Married to the screen," she might laugh, or "My leading men change with every script." Such remarks charmed colleagues and concealed the deeper truth. She longed for something lasting, something beyond the ephemeral glitter of parties and premieres. And yet she was also afraid, perhaps, that permanence might dull her brightness, that to be contained might diminish her freedom. It was a tension she never fully resolved. The solitary breakfasts, the quiet evenings after parties, the fleeting romances, all were part of the fabric of her life in those years. They gave her performances a certain poignancy, for when she played women who laughed too loudly, who charmed too easily, there was always a trace of truth. Audiences sensed it without knowing, that the laughter was both real and protective, that behind the wit there was a longing not yet fulfilled. The spoon against the cup stilled at last, the sound fading into silence. The morning sun shifted, falling upon the tablecloth, upon the newspapers folded with her name in print. Beyond the window, the city stirred with voices, car horns, footsteps, and in that hum of life, a question lingered like the steam from the cooling tea. Who, if anyone, would one day sit across from her, not as admirer or suitor, but as the one who truly saw her? The answer lay waiting in the future, in the glance of a man whose life and career were already entwined with scandal and triumph, whose charm equaled hers, whose presence would both delight and complicate her world. But before that moment of meeting, the room remained empty, the chair across the table unfilled, the question unanswered. And so, in the hush of that empty morning, a whisper of footsteps echoed from beyond, as though someone were approaching. A door would soon open, a glance would soon be exchanged, and her life would tilt irreversibly toward passion. The footsteps that seemed to whisper in the silence of her empty room would, in time, take form in the presence of Rex Harrison, a man whose name was already etched into the annals of stage and screen. Their meeting was not orchestrated by fate's grand machinery, but by the simple intersections of a profession in which actors, producers, and directors crossed paths like stars, brushing against one another in the night sky. Yet when Kay's laughter met Rex's polished charm, it was as though two currents had collided, each recognizing in the other a mirror of wit, sophistication, and longing. Rex Harrison was older than Kay, seasoned by years in the theater, established on both the West End and Broadway. He was known for his elegance, his commanding presence, his voice that could shift from clipped irony to velvet persuasion in a single line. He carried with him not only fame, but also a reputation marked by complexities, marriages, affairs, the whispers of scandal. To many he seemed untouchable, a figure of both admiration and caution. But to Kay, when their eyes first met across a gathering, he was simply a man whose wit danced as quickly as hers, whose gaze seemed to see past the glitter into the restless self she so often concealed. The conversation between them flowed effortlessly, like two musicians improvising on a familiar theme. She teased him, he parried, he flattered her. She deflected with laughter that only deepened his fascination. Where others admired her from afar, Rex leaned closer, unafraid of her brightness, eager to match it with his own. For Kay, accustomed to suitors who wilted under her wit, it was exhilarating to find someone who not only endured it, but delighted in it. London society, ever alert to gossip, noticed quickly. The tall, sparkling comedian and the debonair actor already entangled in complexities of his own marriage. What could come of such a pairing? Whispers traveled through clubs and salons, ink spilled in newspapers, speculation grew. But for Kay and Rex, the world's chatter was background noise. What mattered was the intensity of their connection, the way evening stretched into dawn as they talked, laughed, argued, and circled each other with equal parts passion and caution. Rex was married at the time, a fact that could not be ignored. His union with actress Lily Palmer was itself a fixture of the stage world, admired for its stability despite undercurrents of infidelity and discontent. To fall into Kay's orbit was to court scandal, to risk the ire of critics and colleagues alike, and yet he did not resist. Perhaps he could not. Kay's vitality, her refusal to be merely a decoration, her ability to make him laugh even as she unsettled him, proved irresistible. For Kay, too, the affair was both a liberation and a danger. At last she had found someone who truly saw her, who relished her wit rather than merely enduring it. With Rex, she could be not only the glamorous star but also the quick, restless woman behind the sparkle. He drew out her confidence, encouraged her brilliance, gave her the sense that she was cherished not only for her image but for her essence. And yet she must have known that such love carried risks, that to entangle herself with a married man whose life was already marked by gossip was to step into a storm. But storms can be intoxicating. Their romance unfolded with a mixture of secrecy and audacity, whispered phone calls and public appearances that left little to the imagination. Theirs was not a love of quiet walks and simple dinners, but of passion, heightened by the knowledge of transgression. They became, in the eyes of many, inseparable, a pairing as fascinating as it was controversial. Friends recalled how Rex adored her quick wit, her ability to make him laugh when others could only flatter. She teased him mercilessly, refusing to bow before his fame, and in doing so she won from him a respect few others commanded. He, in turn, gave her a sense of being truly admired, truly central in someone's life. For a woman who had endured so many fleeting romances, this was both balm and fire, and yet beneath the delight, questions lingered. Could such a love endure beyond the thrill of its scandal? Could it withstand the scrutiny of society, the disapproval of colleagues, the strain of Rex's marriage? Perhaps Kay asked herself these questions in quiet moments when the laughter had faded and the night lay still. Perhaps she pushed them aside, choosing instead to live in the immediacy of passion. For she had always known, from the sirens of her adolescence to the applause of her career, that life was uncertain, fleeting, too fragile to wait for perfection. Better to seize joy while it glowed than to postpone it for safety. Their affair grew, deepened, became the central rhythm of her days. She was no longer alone at the breakfast table. Now there was laughter across from her, conversation that stretched beyond wit into tenderness. The loneliness that had once echoed so loudly seemed at last to be silenced. Yet even as she savored this companionship, she must have felt the weight of its fragility, the knowledge that it was built on precarious ground. London society, meanwhile, watched with fascination. Their names appeared in gossip columns, their movements tracked, their glances at public events dissected. To some, they were glamorous. To others, scandalous. But to Kay and Rex, the outside world mattered less than the reality they shared. For in each other they found a rare companionship, a meeting of equals in wit and presence. And so, in the glow of this passion, Kay's life seemed to brighten further. Her performances carried an added vitality, as though her private joy infused her public art. She sparkled in interviews, dazzled on screen, and glowed in society gatherings. To those around her, she seemed to be living a charmed existence, beloved by audiences and cherished by a man whose admiration was obvious. Yet love, especially love born in complication, is seldom free of shadow. Even in their happiest moments, the echo of Rex's existing commitments lingered, an unanswered question in the room. Kay, with her quick perception, must have sensed it. She knew already that joy could be brief, that laughter could turn into silence without warning, but perhaps that knowledge only made her cling more fiercely, laugh more loudly, live more brightly in the moments they had. And so, the two of them danced through London's society, witty, glamorous, admired, and whispered about. Their love was a flame that lit her life with brilliance, yet also cast long shadows upon the walls. The music of their affair filled the air like a waltz, but beneath it a candle burned too quickly, wax spilling unnoticed onto the table, a silent measure of how fleeting such passion might be. The candle burned low, wax spilling unnoticed down its slender stem, the flame leaping higher, as though it knew its life would be brief. So too did their love burn in those years, bright, intoxicating, both admired and whispered about. Kay Kendall and Rex Harrison moved together through London society like figures in a play, the audience captivated not only by their brilliance, but by the scandal that surrounded them. To see them was to witness a paradox, a love that seemed destined and yet dangerous, luminous and yet shadowed by gossip. They were, to those who observed, inseparable. At dinners, their conversation flowed like music, each responding to the other with wit so quick that those around them could scarcely keep pace. At parties, they were often the center of attention, not because they demanded it, but because their presence made the air lighter, the laughter easier. Rex, with his commanding charm, and Kay, with her sparkling vitality, complemented each other in ways that seemed almost theatrical. Some saw in them the perfect pairing of elegance and wit, while others saw only the betrayal of another marriage, the reminder that happiness was purchased at the cost of convention. London, in the 1950s, was a city hungry for stories. Newspapers thrived on rumor, and the lives of actors were fodder for readers seeking both escape and moral lessons. The affair between Rex and Kay was irresistible. Two stars bound together by passion, flouting the boundaries of propriety. Some condemned them, others secretly admired them, but few remained indifferent. Their romance became part of the city's mythology, a story retold in whispers at tea tables and over cocktails, embellished with every telling. For Kay, the adoration was double-edged. She had found, at last, a companion who matched her wit, who cherished her essence beyond her glamour. Yet she knew too well that her love was shadowed by another woman's absence. Lily Palmer, Rex's wife, was herself a celebrated actress, admired for her poise and talent. To be entangled with a man still tied to another was not a position Kay had sought, yet it was the one she now occupied. Did she feel guilt in quiet moments? Did she wonder whether her joy was stolen from another's sorrow? History offers no certainty. What we can say is that she lived in the tension between love's fullness and love's cost, and she bore it with the courage of one who knew that life rarely grants purity in its gifts. And still, she sparkled. On screen, her performances carried an added glow, as though the passion of her private life infused every line she spoke. Audiences found her irresistible. Critics praised her comic timing. Directors sought her for roles that demanded both elegance and vivacity. Off-screen, her wit and charm made her the darling of social gatherings. She seemed, to all who saw her, to be living a charmed existence, beautiful, beloved, adored. Few guessed how deeply she weighed the contradictions of her position, how often she must have looked into the mirror and seen both joy and shadow reflected. Theirs was not a love of quiet domesticity. It was fiery, unpredictable, filled with arguments as well as laughter. Kay's quick temper, sharpened by her wit, sometimes clashed with Rex's commanding nature. Yet even in quarrels, they found fascination with one another. Friends noted that their disagreements often ended in laughter, as though neither could remain serious for long in the other's company. They thrived on intensity, on the thrill of a love that was always slightly out of balance, always threatened by the outside world. The scandal, rather than diminishing her, seemed to intensify her allure. She was no longer simply an actress admired for her screen presence. She was a woman of passion, unafraid to seize love even at the cost of convention. To some, she became a symbol of defiance, living by her own terms. To others, she was reckless, a figure destined for heartbreak. Perhaps she was both, But what mattered most was that she was alive in every moment, unwilling to let fear dictate the course of her heart. Imagine them together in those years, seated at a corner table in a London restaurant, candlelight flickering on their faces. Rex leans in, telling a story with his rich, measured voice. Kay interrupts with a jest that makes him laugh so loudly the neighboring tables turn to look. She raises an eyebrow, teasing him further, and he gazes at her with admiration that is impossible to conceal. Around them, the room hums with curiosity, with envy, with judgment. But at their table, there is only the immediacy of love, the sense that the rest of the world has fallen away. Yet candles burn quickly when the flame is high. Theirs was a romance that could not remain hidden, and with visibility came pressure. Choices would have to be made, lives altered, commitments broken or reshaped. Kay, though radiant in public, must have felt the weight of uncertainty pressing upon her. Would Rex remain with her? Would he choose her fully, or would she forever remain in the liminal space of the other woman? These questions lingered in her heart even as she laughed, even as she sparkled on screen and in society. And still, she clung to the joy they shared. For Kay, who had known the loneliness of empty mornings and fleeting romances, the passion with Rex was too powerful to forsake. She chose to live within it, to embrace its brightness despite the shadows. Perhaps she believed that true love is always imperfect, always entangled with pain. Or perhaps she simply refused to deny herself the fullness of feeling when it finally came. The candle, though burning too quickly, still gave light. Their love, though scandalous, gave her life a richness it had not known before. It was both blessing and burden, both salvation and risk. And as the wax continued to spill silently onto the table, unnoticed by most, the flame flickered higher, casting their entwined figures in a glow that dazzled all who looked upon them. And yet, in the stillness beyond the laughter, a telephone began to ring in the night, its sound sharp and insistent, unanswered as the candle guttered low. The telephone rang in the quiet of the night, its shrill tone cutting through the silence with a kind of urgency that seemed to demand response. Yet it went unanswered, its echo lingering in the darkened room, as if to remind her that some calls cannot be avoided forever, that even passion must contend with the interruptions of reality. For in the life Kay Kendall now lived with Rex Harrison, love was not merely a private sanctuary, but a complicated tangle of secrecy, judgment, and choices deferred. Theirs was a romance that could not escape the gaze of others. Every appearance together was noted, every whisper repeated, every gesture interpreted. They tried, in their way, to carve out moments of intimacy beyond the reach of prying eyes, but fame is a net that rarely loosens its grip. Friends and colleagues were divided, some delighted by their vitality together, others wary of the shadows cast by Rex's marriage to Lily Palmer. The telephone ringing in the night was the sound of that tension, the world calling them back to reckon with what lay unresolved. For Kay, the balance was precarious. She had found in Rex a love that filled the emptiness of her solitary breakfasts, a companionship that delighted and challenged her in equal measure. Yet she also knew that she was living within a structure already fragile, already strained by scandal. Each day carried the risk of exposure, of condemnation, of disappointment. Did she lie awake, listening to that unanswered ringing in her mind, wondering whether she would one day be abandoned, left again to face the silence alone? Perhaps she did, though her laughter in public never betrayed it. Rex, for his part, was torn between two worlds. His marriage to Lily Palmer, though increasingly hollow, still bound him with ties of respect and shared history. Lily herself was no stranger to the complexities of love and infidelity. Her poise and dignity allowed her to endure what many could not. But the presence of Kay altered everything. Rex could not resist the vitality she brought, the joy that lit his days, the wit that matched his own. He straddled two lives, and in doing so, he placed Kay in a position both intoxicating and uncertain. Society judged them harshly, as society often does. Moralists whispered of betrayal, columnists speculated on endings, acquaintances offered veiled remarks at parties. Yet scandal, though sharp, was also part of their allure. There was something irresistible in watching two stars defy convention, living as though love justified its own existence. To their admirers, they seemed fearless; to their detractors, reckless. Kay, caught in the middle, bore the weight of both admiration and censure. Behind closed doors, however, the story was not always glamorous. The secrecy, the constant need to balance appearances, the knowledge of others' pain, all created a tension that could not be escaped. There were arguments, nights of sharp words followed by laughter, mornings when uncertainty pressed heavily. Yet through it all, their bond remained fierce. Kay, with her quick wit, could not be easily silenced, and Rex, with his commanding presence, was not easily swayed. They clashed, they reconciled, they laughed again. Their love was not gentle, but tempestuous, and perhaps it was that very tempest which made it irresistible to them both. In such a relationship, every moment was heightened. A dinner together became a celebration, a walk through the park a risk, a night at home a sanctuary fragile as glass. The intensity gave their love a richness, but it also wore upon them. Kay's health, already whispering its warnings through the quiet coughs she tried to disguise, must have felt the strain, and yet she refused to yield. She lived in the immediacy of passion, unwilling to retreat into caution. Her friends sometimes worried. They saw her radiance, but they also glimpsed the shadows beneath it. They wondered whether Rex would ever fully choose her, whether she would find herself heartbroken after giving so much of herself. Kay brushed off such concerns with laughter, unwilling to admit doubt. Perhaps she truly believed that love, however precarious, was worth the risk. Or perhaps she feared that to acknowledge the uncertainty would break the spell. The telephone, unanswered, continued to ring in the background of her life. It was the voice of society demanding accountability, of morality insisting on its due, of choices deferred but not denied. Kay must have known, even as she leaned into the warmth of Rex's affection, that one day the call would be picked up, the reckoning faced. Yet until that day came, she chose to live brightly, to fill her hours with wit and laughter, to seize what joy the world allowed. And so the nights continued, parties, dinners, conversations that stretched into dawn. She dazzled in public, glowed in private, and carried within her the awareness that nothing was secure. To some, her life seemed scandalous, to others, enviable. To herself, it was simply life, lived as fully as she could, with passion outweighing caution. The telephone grew silent at last, its ring fading into memory. In its place came another sound, the soft patter of rain against the glass of a hospital window, droplets tracing uncertain paths down the pane, each one a reminder of fragility, of the body's quiet rebellion against even the brightest flame. The rain traced its uncertain lines down the hospital glass, each droplet following its own path before merging with another and disappearing into the sill. Kay watched them once, perhaps during one of those early visits when fatigue had become too heavy to ignore, when the cough she had laughed off as nothing more than weariness began to demand more serious attention. Outside, the city moved as always, taxis splashing through puddles, umbrellas tilting against the wind, the ordinary rhythm of London life continuing. Inside, the world slowed, hushed by the sterile air, the muted voices of nurses, the rustle of curtains drawn across pale light. She had lived too brightly, too busily to imagine herself confined by illness. Her days had been filled with film sets, with laughter spilling into champagne glasses, with the warmth of Rex's company and the applause of audiences. But now there was another rhythm. Quiet examinations, whispered consultations, the weight of a doctor's gaze lingering longer than she wished. She brushed it aside, of course, joking with friends, teasing Rex, refusing to admit weakness. Yet the body does not lie. The fatigue returned more quickly. The cough deepened. The mirror began to reveal a pallor that no powder could entirely conceal. The doctors themselves were cautious in their words. In those days, the language of illness was often softened, truths concealed as much out of mercy as of habit. For a woman in her prime, whose spirit was so fiercely alive, the revelation of something grave would have been unbearable. Rex, too, became part of that silence. He listened to the diagnoses. He absorbed the whispered terms: anemia, infection, something in the blood, and he chose to shield her from the full knowledge. Out of love, perhaps, or out of fear, he did not tell her all that he had learned. And so Kay continued, half knowing and half denying, aware that something was amiss but unwilling to give it shape. She laughed more loudly, worked more determinedly, determined to show no weakness. On set, she sparkled as always, though the effort cost her more with each passing day. Between takes, she would sometimes retreat to her dressing room, lying down for a moment before returning to the lights. Colleagues noticed her exhaustion, but she waved away their concern with a quip. To admit fragility was not in her nature. Rex's devotion deepened in these years. Whatever doubts or conflicts had marked the beginning of their affair were now overshadowed by his determination to be near her, to protect her, to carry what burdens he could. He accompanied her to appointments, comforted her in moments of weakness, reassured her when anxiety clouded her laughter. Theirs, once a romance tinged with scandal, became in illness a partnership of profound tenderness. The world may have judged them, but within the circle of her fading strength, Rex became her anchor. Still, secrecy lingered. Kay did not know the full truth of her condition, that the illness gnawing at her was not something that would pass with rest or treatment, but something far more relentless. Leukemia, the doctors whispered, a word heavy with finality in an era when medicine offered little hope. Rex chose silence, believing that to spare her the knowledge was an act of love. Did he rob her of the chance to prepare, or did he grant her the grace of hope? The question remains as unanswerable as the raindrops tracing their paths down the glass. In her performances, the strain sometimes showed. A glance too tired, a gesture less steady, a laugh cut short by breathlessness. Yet she persisted, unwilling to let illness define her. To audiences, she remained radiant, the comedian whose timing was impeccable, whose elegance was undiminished. They did not see the shadows backstage, the moments of collapse, the quiet hands of Rex steadying her. She refused to let them see. For her, performance was not merely art, but resistance, a refusal to yield to despair. And still, in quieter hours, the questions must have haunted her. Why was her body failing when her spirit remained so strong? Was this fatigue merely the cost of too much work, or was it something deeper? Did she ever sense, despite the silence of those around her, that her time was shorter than she had believed? Perhaps she did, for intuition often speaks where words fail, and perhaps it was that intuition which drove her to live each day more fully, to seize joy with even greater ferocity. The rain continued against the glass, steady and unrelenting. Inside, she turned her face away from the window, back toward the world of scripts and costumes, of laughter and companionship. She would not let herself be defined by shadows, not yet. There was still light to create, still laughter to give. And so she rose from the hospital bed, adjusted her coat, and stepped once more into the city's hum, her cough muffled beneath the sound of footsteps, her fragility hidden beneath the brilliance of her smile. The city accepted her return, the lights of theaters glowing as though nothing had changed. Audiences laughed, society admired, Rex loved, and Kay sparkled. Yet the rain against the glass lingered in memory, a quiet rhythm beneath the music of her days, a reminder that even the brightest flame flickers when the winds rise. And from that rain-slick window, a letter lay folded on the bedside table, unopened, its contents known only to the one who had written it. A letter of truth withheld, of words never spoken, resting in silence as her laughter echoed down corridors of film and memory. The folded letter rested on the table by the hospital bed, its paper faintly creased where it had been handled but never opened. Words unsaid carry a weight heavier than those spoken, and in that letter, or in the silence that hovered around it, lay the truth of what she did not yet know. The doctors had spoken in low tones, their voices heavy with words that changed everything. Leukemia, an illness of the blood, swift and merciless, offering no reprieve. In an age when cures were not yet imagined, such a diagnosis was a sentence that left little time. Rex Harrison heard those words, absorbed their gravity, and chose a path that few would dare. He chose silence. He could not bring himself to tell Kay. To her, life was still laughter, work, champagne, the embrace of love. To reveal the truth would strip her of hope, he believed, and hope was the one medicine left. Out of love, or perhaps out of fear of watching her despair, he decided to protect her from knowledge that could not be undone. Kay, for her part, sensed only fragments. She knew she was unwell, that her strength was fading more quickly, that the cough was no longer harmless. But she did not know the name of what shadowed her, nor the certainty with which it had already marked her. She joked with friends about doctors fussing too much. She teased Rex for worrying. She laughed even when her body betrayed her. The letter remained unopened, and the truth remained unspoken. In this silence, tenderness deepened. Rex, who had once been divided between two lives, now devoted himself wholly to her. The scandal of their affair was eclipsed by the devotion of their love in the face of mortality. He accompanied her constantly, guarding her from whispers, shielding her from fatigue, reassuring her when shadows pressed too close. Their romance, once defined by gossip and defiance, was now defined by an intimacy that only love in the face of loss can create. And yet, one wonders, was the silence a gift or a theft? Did Rex spare her the torment of knowing, allowing her to live her final days in joy? Or did he deny her the right to choose how she might face the end? History cannot answer. What remains is the image of a woman who sparkled to the last, unaware of the full truth, her laughter echoing even as her body faltered. It is an image at once tender and unbearably tragic. On set, she continued to give brilliance. Her timing, though strained by fatigue, was still impeccable. Colleagues admired her resilience, unaware of the shadow looming just beyond. Audiences who watched her on screen in those final years saw only glamour, wit, and radiance. They did not know that each scene was wrested from a body already failing, that behind each laugh there was breathlessness, behind each sparkle a flicker of pain. The concealment, both hers and Rex's, allowed her to remain the star she had always been, untouched by pity in the eyes of the public. Rex carried the burden alone, confiding only in those closest to him. To watch the woman he adored live without knowledge of her fate must have been a torment. Each time she laughed, he must have heard the echo of its brevity. Each time she spoke of the future, of roles to come, of journeys to be taken, he must have felt the sting of promises he knew could not be fulfilled. Yet he did not break his silence. Love, in his eyes, demanded protection, even if protection required deception. And so their life together took on a strange, bittersweet quality. They lived as though tomorrow stretched endlessly before them, even as tomorrow slipped away piece by piece. Friends recalled the warmth of their companionship, the way Rex looked at her with a mixture of adoration and sorrow, the way Kay continued to fill rooms with her brightness. She believed, as all around her encouraged her to believe, that she was merely fighting an illness that time and rest would overcome. That belief gave her courage, and courage gave her laughter. The unopened letter remained by her bedside, a silent witness to what was withheld. Its paper grew faintly yellowed, its contents never revealed to the one for whom it was intended. Perhaps, she suspected, intuition often whispers where truth is concealed. Perhaps she chose, in her own way, not to press too deeply, to let herself be carried by hope rather than by knowledge. Or perhaps she truly believed, to the very end, that recovery was possible. The ambiguity lingers like the folded paper itself, never opened, never resolved. And so her days passed, filled with work when she could, with rest when she must, with Rex's presence always near. Their love, scandalous at its beginning, became sanctified by tenderness. Theirs was no longer the passion of society columns, but the intimacy of quiet care, of laughter shared in the shadow of fragility, of devotion tested by silence. Outside, the rain ceased and the glass cleared, but the memory of the droplets tracing their uncertain paths remained, like the path of her life itself, brilliant, unpredictable, too soon merged into silence. The letter, folded and unopened, still lay upon the table, waiting. And from that stillness came another sound, the cough that broke her laughter, sharp and unrelenting, echoing in the quiet room where even Rex's steady presence could not muffle its insistence. The cough broke through her laughter, sharp and unrelenting, scattering the music of her voice like glass shattering against stone. For a moment she pressed a handkerchief to her lips, her eyes narrowing with a flicker of pain. But then, almost at once, she smiled again, waved away concern, and let her laughter resume as though nothing had happened. Such was her nature, to turn frailty into jest, to mask weakness with charm, to insist that joy remain even when her body resisted it. Those around her, uncertain whether to believe the mask or the truth behind it, allowed themselves to be carried by her brightness, for it was easier to laugh with her than to acknowledge the shadows gathering at her edges. On film sets, the pattern became familiar. Kay would arrive with her usual vitality, tall and elegant, her wit already filling the air before cameras began to roll. She would rehearse lines with precision, offer suggestions that lightened the tone of a scene, draw laughter from crew members who could not help but be caught in her orbit. Then, between takes, she would slip into her dressing room, sit down heavily, and let the silence settle upon her until she could gather strength to return. Those brief respites were hidden from the public, unseen by audiences who continued to believe her as radiant as ever. Directors admired her professionalism even as they sensed her struggle. To watch her work was to witness defiance. Every gesture, every perfectly timed line was an act of resistance against the illness quietly consuming her. For Kay, performance had always been life itself. Now it became survival. She was determined not to let her career be defined by frailty, not to let audiences pity her. If they were to remember her, it would be for laughter, for wit, for grace. And so she poured all that remained of her strength into each scene, each interview, each public appearance. Rex was never far. His devotion, once tempered by hesitation and divided loyalties, was now complete. He watched her with a mixture of pride and anguish, proud of her brilliance, anguished by the knowledge she did not possess. He alone carried the burden of truth, the knowledge that time was shortening with every day, that the cough was not merely weariness, but the sound of mortality pressing closer. He shielded her from it as he always had, offering encouragement, comfort, silence. Yet he must have felt the cruel irony of applauding her laughter while knowing how fragile it had become. Friends noticed the changes. She was thinner, more easily fatigued, her energy quick to fade, yet her humor remained intact. She joked about her exhaustion, teased colleagues, insisted she was fine. Few dared to question her further, for her spirit seemed indomitable. To contradict her laughter felt almost sacrilegious, as though one might extinguish the flame by acknowledging the shadows. And so they played along, accepting her brightness as truth, even when the cough told another story. It is in these moments that her courage becomes most clear. She could have withdrawn, retreated from public life, allowed herself the comfort of rest and seclusion. Instead, she chose to remain visible, to give her audience joy even as her body protested. She gave them not just performances, but pieces of herself, fragments of vitality drawn from reserves she scarcely had. Each smile, each perfectly timed remark was both a gift and a sacrifice. At times, she must have felt the cost. Alone with Rex, perhaps, or in the stillness of her dressing room, she may have let the mask slip, may have admitted the weariness that pressed upon her. Rex would comfort her, holding her hand, assuring her that all would be well. Did she believe him? Did she cling to the hope he offered? Or did she sense, deep within, that hope was only another form of love's protection? Perhaps she knew more than she admitted, choosing silence of her own to spare him the pain of confession. Two silences entwined, his in concealing the truth, hers in refusing to ask it. And still she worked. Her final films bear the marks of that determination, her wit shining even as her strength waned. Audiences laughed as they always had, unaware of the cost behind the laughter. To them, she was still Kay Kendall, radiant comedian, dazzling presence. They did not see the pauses between takes, the cough muffled in handkerchiefs, the exhaustion that sent her home to bed, while others stayed to celebrate. Her legacy was preserved in the illusion, and perhaps that was exactly what she wished. Illness changes the texture of time. Days grow heavy, hours stretch and collapse. The ordinary rhythms of life become precious. For Kay, every moment of laughter became a treasure, every scene on film a piece of immortality. She was living not only for herself, but for those who would remember her. Perhaps she knew, even if not consciously, that her days were numbered. Perhaps she felt the urgency pressing her, driving her to work, to laugh, to shine as brightly as possible before the light dimmed. Rex watched, helpless and devoted. To see her sparkle while knowing what lay ahead must have been torment, and yet he never faltered. He shielded her from the truth, but he also shielded her from despair, and in doing so, he gave her the gift of joy unclouded by fear. Their love, once judged scandalous, had now become a sanctuary, a partnership defined by tenderness and care. Theirs was no longer merely a romance, but a vigil. His for her health, hers for the laughter she insisted on giving the world. The cough broke again, sharper this time, echoing through the quiet of her dressing room. She pressed the handkerchief to her lips, her shoulders trembling, her breath unsteady. Then, with a deep inhale, she straightened, powdered her face, adjusted her costume, and returned to the set. The cameras rolled, the lines were spoken, the laughter rang out once more. The world never saw the tremor behind the brilliance. And when the day ended, when the lights dimmed and the reels clicked to a stop, the silence settled once more. In that silence lay the truth she was never told, the truth that Rex carried for her, the truth that shaped every moment of their remaining time. The set grew dark, the echo of her laughter still hanging in the rafters. And beyond the studio walls, in the city where new stars were already rising, a spotlight faded quietly, its glow dimming as another brightened beside it. The spotlight dimmed slowly, its circle of brilliance shrinking upon the stage floor until only a faint glow remained, and then it vanished altogether. Beyond it, another beam flared into life, illuminating a new figure, a new voice, a new presence. Such was the rhythm of the cinematic world in the late 1950s, ever restless, ever hungry for the next star, the next novelty, the next face to embody the mood of the age. For Kay Kendall, whose radiance had once seemed unassailable, the shift was palpable. She was still admired, still sought after, still remembered for her wit and brilliance. But the tide of the industry was changing, and she, already weakened by illness, felt the undertow. British cinema itself was entering a period of transition. The comedies and romances that had carried audiences through the first post-war decade were giving way to grittier narratives, to kitchen sink dramas, and voices of working-class realism. The glamour that Kay embodied, the elegance threaded with laughter, no longer defined the direction of the screen. Younger stars emerged, their faces fresher, their stories rawer, their accents closer to the streets than to drawing rooms. The public, ever eager for novelty, turned their gaze toward them, leaving behind the polished sophistication of an earlier era. Kay, attuned as she was to the subtleties of perception, must have sensed this change. Once the darling of audiences and critics alike, she now found herself in a world where her style of comedy seemed less urgent, her elegance less aligned with the new aesthetic of realism. The applause remained, but it was no longer thunderous. It had softened, grown nostalgic, as though she already belonged more to memory than to the present. For any artist, such a shift is painful. For Kay, already battling the hidden enemy within her body, it was doubly cruel. Yet she did not retreat. Even as roles grew fewer, she poured herself into those she received, determined to prove that her artistry could not be confined by fashion. She sought to expand, to reveal the depth beneath her comic brilliance, to explore characters with greater complexity. And when opportunities failed to arrive, she still carried herself in public with the same sparkle, refusing to let the world see defeat. She dressed elegantly, spoke wittily, attended gatherings with Rex by her side. She laughed, even as the cough grew more insistent, even as fatigue pressed more heavily. Rex watched her with a mixture of pride and anguish. He saw what the world did not, the toll of illness, the cost of maintaining radiance against the pull of shadows. To him, she was not fading, not diminished. She was luminous still, her courage only deepening his devotion. He shielded her from the knowledge of her diagnosis, but he could not shield her from the reality of shifting tides, from the indifference of an industry always chasing the new. Perhaps he wished he could protect her from that as well, to keep her forever in the moment of thunderous applause. But no man, however devoted, can command time. And so Kay lived within this fragile balance, between past triumphs and uncertain futures, between laughter and cough, between brilliance and fatigue. The world outside celebrated new stars, yet still looked back with affection on her. She occupied a strange space, both present and already remembered, both admired and gently set aside. It was a liminal space, one that made her both proud and uneasy. For an actress whose vitality had always been her gift, to be seen as belonging to the past was a wound as sharp as any whisper of illness. In the quiet of evenings, when the parties ended and the cameras ceased, she must have felt the solitude of this shift. Did she wonder what roles might have been hers had time allowed, what dramatic depths she could have plumbed had she been granted the years? Did she envy the younger stars whose paths were just beginning, or did she feel only the bittersweet knowledge that she had lived her brief moment fully? Perhaps she felt all of these, for the heart rarely settles on one emotion alone. Still, she laughed. She sparkled. She refused to let audiences see her as diminished. Her interviews carried the same wit, her appearances the same elegance. She was, until the end, Kay Kendall, dazzling, charming, quick of tongue and warm of spirit. The fading spotlight did not extinguish her glow, it merely cast her brilliance into sharper relief, as though the darkness around her made her flame more vivid. Yet the fragility remained. Every day demanded more strength, every performance more effort. The applause, when it came, was both balm and reminder that she was still loved, but also that time was slipping away. Rex held her close, offering comfort, sharing laughter, bearing the weight of truth alone. Their love, once fiery and scandalous, had become tender and solemn, shaped by the knowledge he carried, and she did not. The world outside changed rapidly. Cinema moved forward, the tide sweeping new voices onto its shores. Kay, though still present, was increasingly spoken of in tones of affection tinged with nostalgia, as though she already belonged to the gallery of stars whose brilliance had passed. And yet she lived, she worked, she laughed, refusing to be relegated to memory while breath still filled her lungs. The spotlight that had faded upon the stage flickered once more, briefly, casting a glow upon her face. It was a reminder that even as new stars rose, her presence remained unforgettable, her artistry still alive in the reels that turned in darkened theaters. The industry might shift, but her laughter still reached audiences, her timing still drew smiles, her elegance still commanded admiration. And when the spotlight dimmed again, leaving her in shadow, another image emerged, a single rose placed in a vase upon a table, its petals beginning to curl, its beauty undiminished yet fragile, its fragrance filling the room even as it wilted. The rose stood in its vase, its petals beginning to curl at the edges, its fragrance soft but lingering, filling the room with sweetness even as its form betrayed the inevitability of decline. Kay might have glanced at such a flower once, smiling at its beauty, teasing Rex for choosing one that would not last the week, never suspecting that she, too, had become a rose in her own season, radiant, fragrant, admired, yet fragile in ways unseen. Her final months unfolded much like the life of that rose, brief but luminous, made precious by the certainty that the bloom would not endure. Rex Harrison, once a man torn between roles and reputations, became in these days entirely devoted. His presence by her side was constant, his attention unwavering. He shielded her from the truth still, sparing her the harsh name of the illness that had claimed her blood. To her, it was merely a lingering weakness, an ailment that could be mended with time and care. To him, it was a shadow he carried in silence, the knowledge that each hour was a gift stolen from the inevitable. In that silence lay both love and sorrow, for every laugh they shared was tinged for him with the ache of knowing how few remained. Kay herself refused to surrender to despair. She continued to live as she always had, with wit, with grace, with laughter that seemed to defy the encroaching dark. Even when fatigue left her unable to work, she kept her spirit bright, entertaining visitors with quips, easing Rex's worry with humor, brushing away sympathy with a jest. She would not be pitied. If her body weakened, her spirit only grew more defiant, as though she believed that to yield to sadness would be to let the illness win. Her friends came to see her, some hesitant, unsure what to say. They left astonished by her vitality, her refusal to bow before suffering. One visitor recalled how she told a story so outrageous, so perfectly timed, that they laughed until tears rolled down their cheeks, forgetting for a moment the frailty of the figure before them. This was her gift to those she loved, to make them laugh even when sorrow hovered close, to give them memories of joy rather than images of decline. Rex, meanwhile, bore the burden of truth alone. He was tender, attentive, protective, but beneath his calm surface lay a grief already forming. Each morning when she woke beside him, he felt gratitude mingled with dread. Each smile she gave him was a treasure he knew would soon be lost. Yet he never let her see the shadow in his eyes. He laughed when she laughed. He teased her gently. He reassured her when she faltered. To her, he was strength and constancy. To himself, he was a man standing vigil over a light he could not keep burning. The days slipped by quietly, punctuated by visits, by small excursions when she had the strength, by evenings of conversation that stretched into the night. Sometimes they would sit together, saying little, letting the silence speak. In those silences, Kay might have felt the fragility of her own body, though she did not name it. She may have known, deep down, that time was slipping, even if the word itself was withheld. But she chose to face it as she faced everything else, with poise, with humor, with love. The rose in the vase wilted further, its petals loosening, its stem bending. Still it gave fragrance, still it gave beauty. Still, it reminded all who looked upon it that transience need not diminish loveliness. So too did Kay give beauty in her final months, beauty of spirit more than of form. The glamour of parties and premieres faded, but in its place shone something deeper, the courage of a woman who refused to be broken, the tenderness of a lover who cherished every moment, the laughter that rang even as the night deepened. For Rex, these months transformed their love. Once defined by scandal, now it was sanctified by devotion. Theirs became a marriage of souls, even if the ceremony came late and the years together were too few. In the quiet of their shared life, away from gossip and applause, they found a peace that had eluded them before. It was fragile, fleeting, but real. And perhaps that was enough. Visitors often remarked on the serenity of their home in those days, as though the walls themselves absorbed the tenderness between them. The world outside was full of noise, new stars rising, cinema shifting, society ever restless. Inside there was only the steady rhythm of care, of companionship, of laughter that refused to die. Still, the signs of decline grew harder to ignore. The cough deepened. The fatigue became constant. Her once bright eyes dimmed with weariness. Yet she continued to mask it, to insist on living fully. She dressed elegantly even when she stayed home. She entertained guests with wit. She refused to let anyone speak of illness as though it defined her. In this, she triumphed. She remained herself to the end, sparkling, defiant, unforgettable. The rose in the vase at last dropped its petals one by one until only the stem remained, fragile and bare. Kay, too, was nearing her end, though she did not know it in words. She sensed it, perhaps, in the silence that often filled Rex's eyes, in the way he held her hand a little too tightly, in the way he lingered by her side as though unwilling to let her out of his sight. She may not have known the name of her illness, but she knew the language of love, and in that language she understood everything. The days of laughter grew fewer, but when they came, they were more precious. Each joke, each quip, each shared smile was a jewel, cherished by Rex, treasured by friends, remembered long after. She gave joy until she could give no more, and in that giving, she secured her immortality. And so, in the hushed air of her final months, the rose wilted, the candle burned low, and the silence deepened. From that silence rose the faint toll of a church bell in the distance, its sound carrying through the evening air, solemn and inexorable, announcing the closeness of an ending. The church bell tolled in the distance, its deep voice rolling over the rooftops of London, solemn and unhurried, each note carrying with it the weight of inevitability. It was a sound as old as the city itself, a sound that marked endings as faithfully as it once had announced beginnings. In December of 1959, it tolled for Kay Kendall, whose laughter had filled theaters, whose wit had brightened gatherings, whose presence had seemed too alive, too radiant to ever be silenced. Yet the bell tolled, and the silence that followed was profound. She died on Christmas Eve, in the hush of a winter night, when the city was alive with carols and the scent of pine and fire smoke. Beyond the hospital walls, families gathered in celebration, children waited for gifts, church choirs raised their voices in hymns of joy. Inside, however, a stillness fell as the 32-year-old actress slipped away, her brief life extinguished not by scandal or folly, but by the quiet cruelty of illness. Leukemia, relentless and unseen, had taken her, and with her it carried the promise of all she might yet have been. Rex Harrison was at her side, as he had been through those final months, devoted to the last. His vigil ended not with revelation, but with loss, for he had never told her the full truth. She went to her death believing she was fighting an illness she might still recover from, never knowing the name of the enemy that had claimed her. Did she suspect? Did she sense, in those final breaths, that her time was shorter than she had been told? Perhaps, But what remains certain is that she left this world surrounded by love, her hand held, her name spoken gently, her memory already gathering in the hearts of those who mourned her. The news of her death spread quickly, carried by newspapers and radio, received with disbelief by audiences who had so recently laughed at her performances. She had seemed eternal in her brightness, too alive to be taken so soon. Letters poured in, tributes were written, fans wept quietly in homes across Britain and beyond. The image of her tall, elegant frame, her mischievous smile, her quick tongue, it all seemed impossible to reconcile with the stillness of death. A star extinguished at 32 left not only sorrow but a deep sense of incompleteness, as though the story had ended in mid-sentence. London itself seemed to pause. For a woman who had embodied its post-war spirit, glamorous, witty, unbroken, her loss was felt like the dimming of a light in the city's own recovery. Fellow actors, critics, friends gathered in small groups, remembering her laughter, her presence, her generosity. Some recalled the way she made sets brighter simply by walking onto them. Others remembered private kindnesses, words of encouragement, small gestures that revealed a heart as warm as it was quick. All remembered the vitality that had seemed inexhaustible, now suddenly gone. Her funeral was quiet, marked by dignity rather than spectacle. The glamour that had surrounded her in life gave way to simplicity in death. Flowers were laid, prayers were spoken, tears were shed. Rex, stricken with grief, stood among them, a man who had shared her laughter and carried her secret, now left with silence. His devotion, once questioned by gossip, was made visible in the sorrow etched upon his face. Whatever scandals had once surrounded them, now only love and loss remained. For those who knew her, the days that followed were filled with reflection. What had made her so unique, so unforgettable? It was not merely her beauty, though that was striking, nor her talent, though that was real and rare. It was the combination of wit, warmth, and vitality, the refusal to be anything less than fully alive. She made others laugh, not to mock them, but to lift them, to make the world lighter for a moment. In this, she left behind not only films, but memories, not only performances, but impressions upon the hearts of those who encountered her. And yet, her death raised questions that linger still. What roles might she have played had she lived? What depths might she have revealed? What dramas might she have embodied? What laughter might she have given the world? The tragedy of her death at 32 is not only that she was lost, but that all she might have become was lost with her. She is remembered not as an actress who declined, but as one whose flame was cut short at its brightest. Her immortality lies in the brevity of her life, the way it preserved her forever young, forever radiant, forever at the height of her powers. The church bell tolled again, softer now, its echo fading into the cold winter air. The sound carried through the city, through the memories of those who loved her, through the pages of newspapers and the reels of film that still spun in projection rooms. It was a reminder of endings, but also of remembrance. For even as the bell marked her passing, her laughter continued to echo in the minds of audiences. Her presence still shimmered upon screens. Her name still lingered upon lips. And when the bell fell silent at last, there was only stillness, a stillness that seemed unbearable, for it held the absence of her voice, her laughter, her wit. Yet within that stillness lay the seeds of legend, the transformation of a woman into memory, of a life into story, of laughter into legacy. From that silence, a reel of film snapped in the projector, the image dissolving into white, as though her story had ended not with closure, but with sudden interruption, leaving the audience staring at the blankness, imagining what might have been. The reel snapped in the projector, the image dissolving into a sudden blankness, the screen washed in white light that illuminated only absence. Audiences sat in the dark, staring at the void where moments earlier Laughter had danced, faces had glowed, voices had carried stories. Such was the feeling in the days and years after Kay Kendall's death, that of a story interrupted, a performance ended before its conclusion, leaving the audience to imagine what might have followed. Her legacy, luminous, yet incomplete, was built as much on what she had given as on what she might yet have become. Her films remained, preserved in their reels, her laughter frozen in time. Viewers could still see her glide across the screen in Genevieve, hear her sharp timing in Doctor in the House, delight in her sparkle in The Reluctant Debutante. These roles, light in tone, comic in essence, revealed her brilliance, but also hinted at more. Beneath the wit there was depth. Beneath the glamour, vulnerability. Audiences watching after her death sensed it more keenly, seeing in her performances not merely comedy, but the fragility of a spirit who gave laughter even as life was fleeting. Her films became more than entertainments. They became memorials, places where her presence endured. Critics, too, reflected on what was lost. Some praised her comic genius, her ability to transform a line into gold, a gesture into delight. Others mourned the dramas she never played, the tragedies she might have embodied, the complexity she hinted at but never fully revealed. It was as though she had been frozen at the threshold of a greater career, one that illness denied her. The sadness of her legacy lay not in decline, but in interruption. She was remembered not as a star who faded, but as one who was taken at her brightest, her light cut short. For Rex Harrison, her legacy was deeply personal. He had carried her secret, protected her from knowledge, devoted himself to her in her final months. After her death, he spoke of her with tenderness, honoring her memory, preserving her place not merely as an actress, but as the woman he had loved. Their love, once scandalous, was remembered now with reverence, sanctified by sorrow. Whatever judgments society had once passed, history softened them, seeing instead the devotion that marked her final days. In his grief, Rex gave her another kind of immortality. Through his remembrance, her story continued to be told. Friends recalled her laughter, her generosity, her irreverence. They spoke not of scandal, but of warmth, not of gossip, but of kindness. She had a way of making others feel brighter in her presence, of lifting spirits with a single remark, of turning ordinary moments into memories. This was her gift, and it endured long after her passing. Those who knew her remembered not only the actress, but the friend, the woman who filled a room with vitality, who refused to let despair dim her humor. Her legacy extended beyond those who knew her personally. For audiences who discovered her films in later years, she became a symbol of a bygone era. A star whose elegance belonged to the 1950s, but whose vitality remained timeless. Younger viewers, encountering her on screen long after her death, were struck by how modern she seemed, her wit sharp, her presence alive, her performances free of stiffness. She transcended the years, her appeal undiminished, and yet the incompleteness of her story shaped her legend. To die young is to be remembered young, to remain forever in the bloom of beauty and talent, unshadowed by age or decline. Kay Kendall became part of that lineage of stars, James Dean, Marilyn Monroe, Carole Lombard, whose brevity became part of their brilliance. The question of what might have been haunts such figures, and in that haunting they achieve a form of immortality. Kay, too, was remembered as much for the roles unwritten as for those she played, as much for the promise unfulfilled as for the performances preserved. In time, her name became less common in the chatter of the present, but more secure in the reverence of memory. She was celebrated in retrospectives, her films re-watched, her story retold in books and articles. Each retelling emphasized the same paradox, that she had given so much and yet left so much undone, that her brilliance was undeniable and her absence unbearable. She became a figure of both joy and sorrow, her life a testament to the beauty and fragility of human existence. Her legacy was also one of style. She embodied a kind of elegance that was distinctly post-war, glamorous yet approachable, witty yet poised. Fashion writers remembered her tall frame, her gowns, her ability to carry herself with grace. Comedians remembered her timing, actors her generosity on set. To each who reflected on her, she was something slightly different, but always unforgettable. And so, in the years after her passing, Kay Kendall lived on, not in body, but in film, in memory, in story. Her laughter continued to echo, her presence continued to shimmer, her name continued to be spoken. The reel may have snapped in the projector, the story may have ended abruptly, but the image remained, projected again and again for audiences who never ceased to be charmed. The projector, its reel repaired, hummed once more, casting her figure upon the screen. She smiled, she laughed, she sparkled, as though no illness had ever touched her, as though no ending had ever come. Her legacy was this: to remain forever luminous, forever alive, forever dancing on the edge of promise. And yet, as the film reached its close, the reel slowed, the clicking softened, and the image dissolved into shadow. From that shadow arose a question that lingers still. Was it her brevity that gave her immortality? Was it her brevity that gave her immortality? The question lingers like a faint echo in an empty theater, unanswered, and perhaps unanswerable. For what do we remember most about those whose lives end too soon? The fullness of what they gave, or the vastness of what they might have given had time allowed. Kay Kendall's life was a constellation of brilliance scattered across too short a sky, her laughter a melody cut off before its final notes, her presence a flame extinguished at the height of its glow. Yet in that very brevity, she became eternal, forever young, forever radiant, forever fixed in memory as a star who never dimmed. Her life, when viewed from a distance, seems woven from contradictions. She was born into the modest, uncertain world of traveling actors, yet rose to become an emblem of post-war glamour. She dazzled society with wit and elegance, yet returned home to mornings of solitude at an empty table. She found love in the arms of a man bound to another, scandalous in the eyes of the world, yet sanctified in devotion when illness made their bond unbreakable. She was an actress celebrated for comedy, for lightness and laughter, yet she carried within her the shadow of an illness she never fully knew. She lived brightly, joyfully, passionately, yet died quietly at 32, leaving behind a silence deeper than all the laughter she had given. And so the question remains, was her legend forged by what she did or by what she could not do? Her films endure, their celluloid preserving her grace, her timing, her laughter. Audiences still see her glide across the screen, hear her voice, feel the spark of her vitality. They do not see the hospital rooms, the unopened letter, the cough muffled behind laughter. They see only the star, captured forever in moments of brightness. And perhaps that is as she would have wanted it. For Kay, performance was not merely art, but defiance, the insistence that joy could prevail even against despair. In remembering her, we also remember the fragility of life itself. 32 years, so brief, and yet within them, she lived with a fullness that some never know in twice that span. She loved, she was loved, she made others laugh, she left a mark upon her art. Is not immortality measured by remembrance, by the persistence of one's presence in the hearts of others? If so, then Kay Kendall lives still, not only in films, but in memory, in the way her story is retold, in the way her name still evokes both admiration and sorrow. For those who loved her in life, her absence was unbearable. For those who discovered her only after, through the glowing screen, her presence is a revelation. Each generation that encounters her is struck by her freshness, her wit, her refusal to seem dated. She belongs not only to the 1950s, but to all who value laughter, elegance, resilience. She is timeless. Her story, one of those that remind us that beauty and brilliance are not measured by duration, but by intensity. And so, as we close this long telling of her life, we return to the image with which we began. A quiet hospital room in London, December 1959. The hush of white sheets, the muted footsteps of nurses, the scent of flowers. Outside, the city rejoiced in holiday cheer, unaware that within those walls a star was fading. She slipped away not in grandeur, but in stillness, not surrounded by applause, but by the devotion of one who loved her to the last. Yet from that stillness arose a legend, from that silence a story, from that ending an immortality. Perhaps it is not for us to decide whether brevity enhances brilliance or diminishes it. Perhaps the truth is simpler. Kay Kendall lived as she was, bright, witty, glamorous, defiant, and in doing so she gave the world joy. That joy endures, and in it she endures. Her life was not long, but it was radiant, and radiance does not fade with time. It lingers in memory, in film, in story. And so, dear listener, we leave her here, in the glow of memory, her laughter still echoing faintly, her presence still shimmering. Let us carry her story with us, not as tragedy alone, but as a reminder that even brief lives can be filled with brilliance, that even laughter cut short can echo endlessly, that even a rose which wilts too soon leaves fragrance long after its petals fall. The waves of memory lap quietly at the shore, the light fades slowly into dusk, and somewhere, in the quiet recesses of a theater long emptied, the sound of her laughter drifts, once more, soft, unhurried, timeless.